My name is Nadia Osei. I am 34 years old. 9 years ago, I made a decision that most people in my life told me I would regret. I changed my phone number, updated my address with no forwarding information, removed myself from every shared account and family group and digital space where my family could reach me, and I began the long, quiet, frequently difficult work of building a life that did not include them. For 9 years, I had kept that boundary intact. Not perfectly. There had been attempts at contact through mutual connections, through old friends, through a letter delivered to my workplace, 3 years in that I had returned unopened. I had kept the boundary because the reason I had drawn it was real, and because I had learned, in the year before I drew it, that a boundary held halfway is not a boundary at all. And then, 4 months ago, on a Thursday night in November, I put my phone on the nightstand at 10:30 and went to sleep. And when my alarm went off at 6:15 the next morning, and I looked at my screen, I had 37 missed calls and 37 voicemails, all from the same number. A number I did not recognize but which, when I looked up the area code, belonged to the city where my family lived. Before I tell you what was in those voicemails and what I did before I left for work that morning, take a second to like and subscribe and drop your country in the comments below. Now, let me take you all the way back. I am going to tell you why I went no contact, because you deserve to understand the foundation before I build anything on top of it, and because the reason matters to everything that follows. I am going to tell it plainly, and without the softening that people sometimes apply to family stories out of a residual loyalty to people who did not earn it. My family, my parents and my 2 older brothers, Kofi and Darius, had spent the first 23 years of my life making a set of decisions about me that I had absorbed as normal because I had no reference point for anything else. I was the youngest, the only daughter, and I had been treated with the specific mixture of overprotection and undervaluation that certain families apply to daughters. Too controlled to develop independence, too dismissed to be taken seriously. My education had been funded reluctantly and with conditions. My choices had been overridden regularly, from what I studied to where I lived to who I was allowed to be friends with. My opinions at the family table had been treated as charmingly irrelevant at best, disruptive at worst. None of this was done with announced cruelty. All of it was done with the comfortable certainty of people who had decided what I was and found my failure to match the picture mildly inconvenient. The specific event that ended it happened when I was 24. I had, after finishing my degree in accounting, been offered a position at a firm in another city. A real opportunity, the kind that required moving and required saying yes quickly. I had told my family. My father had told me I was not moving, not asked, not discussed, told. My mother had said my father was right, and that there were opportunities closer to home, and that the family needed me nearby. My brothers had said nothing, which was its own answer. I had sat at the family table and looked at the faces of the people who had loved me and controlled me simultaneously for 24 years, and I had understood, with the sudden clarity of a pressure that has been building, for years finding the crack it needs, that this was the last time this particular decision would be made for me. I took the job. I moved. And over the following year, as the relationship deteriorated through my refusals to return for events I had not been asked about, but commanded to attend, through my declining to share my address, through the escalating demands that I account for choices that were mine to make. I made the decision. I changed the number. I disappeared as cleanly and as completely as a person can disappear from a family that has always treated them as a possession. The 9 years that followed were not a story of triumph. I want to be honest about that because the no-contact narrative is sometimes told as a clean victory, and it is not. It is a long, frequently lonely, often grief-adjacent process of building a self without the scaffolding of family, which is harder than it sounds, even when the scaffolding was always partly rotten. I had good years and difficult ones. I built a career in financial consulting that became, by my early 30s, something I was genuinely proud of. I built friendships that had the specific depth of relationships chosen freely rather than inherited. I built a life in a city that was mine in every sense, chosen, constructed, belonging to no one's expectations but my own. I did not think about my family often. This is the honest answer, though it is not the comfortable one. In the first 2 years, I thought about them constantly, the way you think about any amputation, aware of the absence, feeling it as presence. By year 4, the frequency had dropped to occasionally. By year 7, they occupied roughly the same space in my daily consciousness as a chapter of a book I had read and processed and set aside. Real, past, not requiring active attention. I had built something good in the space their absence had created. That is the most accurate thing I can say about the 9 years. The 37 voicemails arrived, as I said, on a Thursday night. I discovered them Friday morning. I sat on the edge of my bed in the early light, and I looked at the screen for a long time before I touched it. 37 voicemails. All from the same number. Timestamp from 10:47 in the evening through to 5:12 in the morning. Across more than 6 hours, which meant someone had been calling, leaving a message, and calling again across the entire night. I made coffee before I listened to them. This was not coldness. It was the understanding, learned over 9 years of managing my own interior life, that I would hear whatever was in those messages better with something warm in my hands and my feet on solid ground than I would hear it sitting stunned on the edge of my bed. I sat at my kitchen table. I pressed play on the first one. The voice was my brother Kofi's. His voice was the voice of a man who had been crying for some time, and had moved past the stage where crying is accompanied by tears into the stage where it lives in the throat and the breath. He said my name. He said he knew I probably would not listen to this. He said he needed me to know that our mother had had a stroke. He said it had happened at dinner, that she had been at the table, and then she had been on the floor, that the ambulance had come, that she was at the hospital. He said the doctors were saying it was significant. He said he did not know what significant meant yet, but that he needed me to know. He said he was sorry to call. He said he understood if I did not respond. His voice broke on the last sentence, and then the message ended. The second voicemail was from 20 minutes later. Still Kofi. More information. She was in surgery. The stroke had affected the left side. They were waiting. His voice had moved from broken to the flat, controlled tone of a person who has decided to hold themselves together by focusing on facts. The third was from 40 minutes after that. Still Kofi, still the hospital, still waiting. By the 6th voicemail, my brother Darius was there. His voice was different from Kofi's, tighter, less expressive, the voice of a man who manages fear by converting it into urgency. He said the doctors needed to speak to all family members. He said they needed to know if there was anything in my mother's medical history that the hospital did not have. He said this in the tone of a man who believes that having a task makes the waiting bearable. By the 12th voicemail, Kofi was crying again, not controlled. He said, "Nadia, I know you have reasons. I know they're real. I'm not calling to argue about any of that. I'm calling because she's asking for you." A pause. "She's been asking since she came out of surgery. Just your name. That's all she's saying." I put down my cup. I listened to all 37. I want to tell you that I did this because I needed to hear the complete picture before I acted, which is true. I also want to tell you that the real reason I listened to all 37 was that I needed to sit with 9 years of silence in the presence of what had broken it, and that doing that required the full accounting, not the summary. The last voicemail was timestamped at 5:12 in the morning. It was Kofi again. He sounded exhausted in the way that people sound, after a night of the worst kind of waiting. He said she had stabilized. He said she was going to need significant rehabilitation. He said the doctors were cautiously optimistic, which was not nothing but was not enough. He said, "I don't know if you'll hear any of these. I don't know if you'll come. But if there's any part of what we were to each other that still means something, not to them, to you, I hope you'll find a way to let it matter tonight." Then a pause. Then, "She just wants to see you, Nadia. That's all." I sat at my kitchen table in the early morning light for a long time after the last message ended. 9 years is a long time. It is long enough to become a different person than you were when you started it. It is long enough to build a life so complete that the absence inside it has healed over and become invisible most days. It is long enough, if you have done the work honestly, to get to a place where the people you left are not the enemy of the life you built, but simply the beginning of it, the painful, necessary, irreplaceable starting point of a person who had to leave in order to become. I had done the work. I had gotten to that place. And, sitting at my kitchen table at 6:45 in the morning with 37 voicemails behind me and a cup of coffee going cold in my hands, I asked myself the question that the place I had gotten to made possible to ask honestly. What do I actually want to do? Not what am I obligated to do. Not what will people think if I do or do not. Not what does the history demand. What do I, Nadia Osei, 34 years old, who left at 25, and built something real in the leaving, what do I want? The answer came without drama. It came with the quiet, plain honesty of a person who has spent 9 years learning to hear themselves clearly. I wanted to see my mother, not to repair everything. Not to return to a family that had treated me as a possession, and pretend the 9 years had been a misunderstanding. Not to walk back into the dynamic that had required me to disappear in order to survive it. I wanted to see my mother, who had asked for me by name in a hospital room, who was 61 years old and had just had a stroke, and who was, underneath everything that had made leaving necessary, still my mother. I booked the first available flight. It left at 9:15. I called Kofi from the gate. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had not slept. I said, "I'm coming." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." Just that. One word. In the voice of a man who had spent the night hoping for something and is now standing inside it, and does not yet have the language for what he feels. I said, "I need you to understand something before I land. I'm coming for her. I'm not coming to pretend the 9 years did not happen or that the reasons for them were not real. I'm coming because she asked for me and because I want to come and for no other reason. Can you work with that?" Kofi said yes. I said, "And Darius?" A pause. "I'll talk to him." I said, "Good." I landed 3 hours later. Kofi met me at the hospital entrance. He looked like a man who had aged a year in a single night, which is what a night like that does to a person. We stood at the entrance for a moment, looking at each other. Two people who had last been in the same room 9 years ago, and who were now standing together outside a hospital at noon on a Friday in November. And then he said, "She's in room 414, and I said, "Okay," and we walked in. My mother was smaller than I remembered. This is always the thing with people you have not seen for a long time. The image you carry is frozen at the moment you last looked, and the actual person has continued aging without your observation. And the gap between the image and the reality requires a recalibration that takes a moment. She was in the hospital bed with monitors and an IV, and the particular stillness of someone whose body has recently been through something significant. Her left side was visibly affected. She saw me when I came through the door. I am not going to tell you what her expression did, because it belongs to her, and it belongs to me, and it is not a thing I am willing to convert into language for any audience. I will tell you that I crossed the room, and I sat in the chair beside the bed, and I took her right hand, the responsive one, and I held it. She said my name, one word, just my name, nothing else, not an apology, not an explanation, just my name in the voice of a woman who had been asking for me and had been answered. I said, "I'm here." We sat like that for a long time. The monitors made their sounds. The afternoon light moved across the window. Kofi stood by the door and said nothing, which was exactly right. There is no clean ending to what I am going to tell you next, because there is no clean ending to 9 years, and a stroke and a family that had been wrong in specific ways for a long time, and is now, slowly and imperfectly, trying to be different. My mother is in rehabilitation. She is making progress that her doctors call encouraging. I have been back twice since November. The visits are careful and real and complicated, in the honest way of things that have a long history and are being rebuilt from the middle rather than the beginning. My father and I have not spoken. That door is not closed, but it has not opened, and I am not pushing it. Darius and I had one conversation in the hospital corridor that was short and honest and left things in a place I can only describe as acknowledged. Not resolved, not repaired, but acknowledged, which is where everything real has to start. Kofi and I text sometimes. He sends updates about my mother. I send back. The 37 voicemails are still on my phone. I have not deleted them. I do not know why exactly, except that they represent something I want to keep a record of. Not the crisis they announced, but the fact of them. 37 calls across 6 hours from a brother who did not know if I would listen and called anyway. That is not nothing. That is, in its own imperfect way, someone trying. I built a life in 9 years of silence. It is a good life. It remains mine. Going back to that hospital room did not cost it, because I went back as the person the 9 years had made me, rather than the person I had been when I left. That is the difference. That is the whole difference. The 37 voicemails came in one night. What I did with them, in the end, was the only thing that was true. I showed up.